There was a city in the 9th century where the streets were lit at night, where hospitals treated patients for free, where scholars were paid their books' weight in gold, and where the combined knowledge of Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt was being translated, corrected, and extended simultaneously under one roof. That city was not Rome, it was not Athens either, and it was not Constantinople, it was Baghdad, and for nearly 5 centuries it was the most advanced, most populated, and most intellectually alive city on the face of the earth. This is the story they forgot to put in your history books.
In 762 CE, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur stood on the banks of the Tigris River and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of human civilization. He had defeated the Umayyad dynasty, moved the seat of Islamic power eastward away from Damascus, and now he needed a capital worthy of what the Abbasid Caliphate intended to become. He chose a small village on the western bank of the Tigris, where the river curved closest to the Euphrates, where trade routes from Persia, Arabia, India, and the Byzantine Empire converged like threads pulled to a single point. He called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. The world would come to know it simply as Baghdad. What al-Mansur built was not merely a city, it was a declaration of intent. The original design was a perfect circle, a geometric statement made in brick and mortar, the city walls enclosing the palace and the great mosque at the center, 4 gates opening in 4 directions to the 4 corners of the known world. Architects, engineers, astronomers, and urban planners from across the Islamic world were brought together to design it. 100,000 workers built it over 4 years. When it was completed, it was unlike any city that had ever been constructed, not because of its size, which was already extraordinary, but because of its organizing principle. Everything flows to the center, all roads lead here, the world has a new capital. Within a generation, Baghdad was the largest city on earth. Estimates of its population at peak vary between 500,000 and 1 million residents, at a time when London had perhaps 10,000 and Paris 20,000. It stretched across both banks of the Tigris, connected by 3 great pontoon bridges. It had a sophisticated water supply system, sewage infrastructure, public baths, and a market system of staggering complexity. It was, by any measure, the most cosmopolitan human settlement the medieval world had produced. But the physical city was only the container. The revolution was fueled by a technological breakthrough. In 751 CE, following the Battle of Talas, the Abbasid Caliphate captured Chinese papermakers. By 794, the first paper mill was established in Baghdad under the patronage of the Barmakid family. Unlike expensive parchment, paper was affordable and durable. This was the democratization of knowledge. While a European monastery might hold a dozen books, Baghdad was about to produce hundreds of thousands. The paper revolution meant that knowledge was no longer the exclusive domain of the elite, it was flowing through the streets. By the 9th century, Baghdad's Street of Stationers, or Souk al-Warakin, reportedly housed over 100 bookstores. Large-scale manuscript production allowed for the first public libraries and enabled scholars to compile massive encyclopedias. This technological leap meant that information was moving at a speed and scale previously impossible. Every mosque, every school, and every hospital had its own library. Baghdad was becoming the world's hard drive, a repository for the collective wisdom of mankind. The city was not just built of stone and brick, but of paper and ink. The intellectual engine was the translation movement. Its central figure was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, an historian Christian physician known as the Sheikh of the Translators. He revolutionized methodology, prioritizing the sense of the text over literal words. He mastered Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic, translating 129 works of the Greek physician Galen alone. Caliph al-Ma'mun reportedly paid Hunayn the weight of his translated books in gold. This movement ensured that the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid were not only preserved but systematically improved upon by scholars working side by side. But it was Harun's son, al-Ma'mun, who turned the gathering into a transformation. Al-Ma'mun founded the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was not simply a library but a funded research institution, a place where scholars were employed, paid generously, and given resources and time. The scholars who worked there came from every corner and every religious tradition. Christians, Jews, Persians, and Hindus all brought their accumulated scientific knowledge. It was a human institution funded by Muslim rulers. The pursuit of truth had no borders. What it produced was the intellectual foundation of the modern world. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi worked at the House of Wisdom and wrote 2 books that changed the history of human thought. The word algebra comes directly from his title. The word algorithm comes from the Latinization of his name. Every time you use a search engine or a computer, you are using conceptual tools that a scholar in Baghdad formalized in the 9th century. He developed algebra specifically to solve practical problems of inheritance, land measurement, and the distribution of salaries in the vast empire. Baghdad was also the birthplace of sophisticated automation. In the 9th century, the Banu Musa brothers published the Book of Ingenious Devices. They described 100 inventions, including automatic control systems using conical valves and float chambers to maintain water levels. They even created the first programmable machine, an automatic flute player powered by a revolving cylinder with pins, the conceptual ancestor of the music box and the computer sequencer. They were engineering safety devices like hurricane lamps and gas masks for miners centuries before these concepts were standard. This tradition reached its zenith with al-Jazari, the father of robotics. His elephant clock was a mechanical marvel that integrated Indian, Egyptian, Greek, and Chinese elements into a single device. He invented the crankshaft and the segmental gear, components critical to the later Industrial Revolution. His musical robot band, a boat with 4 automated musicians, could be programmed with different rhythms representing the first programmable humanoid robots in history. Al-Jazari's work was the ultimate synthesis of cross-cultural knowledge and mechanical ingenuity, a mechanical reflection of Baghdad's diversity. Abu Bakr al-Razi revolutionized medical practice through empirical observation. Legend tells how he chose the site for a new hospital in Baghdad by hanging meat in various quarters and checking which rotted the least. He declared that location the one with the purest air. He was the first to clinically differentiate smallpox from measles in his seminal work. Known for his compassion, he provided music and storytelling for his patients, often treating the poor for free and even supporting them with his own money during their recovery. His 23-volume medical encyclopedia became a standard text in Europe for centuries. Al-Zahrawi, the father of modern surgery, introduced over 200 instruments, many still used today: the scalpel, surgical scissors, and the speculum. He discovered that the human body could absorb catgut sutures after his monkey ate the strings of an aouad. He described the first successful tracheotomy and pioneered methods for treating ectopic pregnancies. His illustrated guide to surgical instruments was the world's first, bridging theory and practice for centuries. He insisted that students study anatomy before surgery, a fundamental principle of medical education that remains the bedrock of surgical training today. Ibn al-Haytham, the father of modern optics, shifted knowledge from speculation to the experimental scientific method. During house arrest in Cairo, he conducted his most famous experiments. In a darkened room, he observed light passing through a tiny hole in a shutter, proving that light travels in straight lines and enters the eye. This debunked the Greek theory that eyes emit rays to touch objects. His book on optics was so foundational that Leonardo da Vinci and Roger Bacon drew directly on it. His scientific method, observation, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, remains our standard for truth. Al-Battani refined the astronomical calculations of Ptolemy with such precision that his measurements of the solar year were more accurate than anything produced in Europe until the 17th century. His calculations were used by Copernicus centuries later. These were not isolated geniuses. They were part of a funded, organized intellectual culture building on every civilization that had come before it. This systemic, state-funded pursuit of knowledge is what makes the Abbasid Golden Age historically unique. The stars were being mapped with divine precision, turning the sky into a clock for humanity. Underneath all of it ran a philosophical commitment rooted in faith. The first word of the Quran revealed was Iqra, read. The Hadith declared that seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. The Abbasid rulers took this not as metaphor but as mandate. The pursuit of knowledge was an expression of Islam. For a century, that conviction produced the most concentrated burst of achievement between the ancient world and the European Renaissance. Baghdad in the 9th century was the center of the world, where the sacred and the scientific were 2 sides of the same coin. But every golden age has its end. In 1258, the horizon darkened with the dust of Hulagu Khan's Mongol horde. Hulagu led a massive army of approximately 150,000 soldiers to the gates of Baghdad. On January 17th, Mongol vanguards routed the caliph's cavalry by flooding their camp. By January 22nd, Hulagu encircled the city. On January 29th, the siege began in earnest. Mongol engineers set up catapults, using palm tree trunks and rocks hauled from the mountains. The city of peace was surrounded by the forces of total annihilation. The pressure was relentless. By February 1st, Mongol troops breached the Ajami Tower, a key fortification. By February 3rd, they secured the tops of the eastern walls. Caliph al-Mustasim attempted to negotiate, sending his son with massive tributes, but Hulagu refused to stop the assault. On February 7th, 3,000 of Baghdad's nobles emerged to surrender. only to be systematically executed. The defenses were decimating, and the end of a world was visible through the cracks in the walls. The Caliph officially surrendered on February 10th. The sack of Baghdad began on February 13th. For 1 week, Mongol troops massacred the population. The House of Wisdom and its 36 public libraries were razed. Historical accounts describe Mongol soldiers throwing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts into the Tigris River. Estimates of the dead range as high as 800,000. To avoid spilling royal blood, the Caliph was rolled in a rug and trampled to death by horses. The heart of the Islamic world was torn out. The destruction was total, both human and intellectual, leaving only shadows where wisdom once reigned. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with the ink of 1 million manuscripts and red with the blood of scholars. Survivors noted that soldiers even used leather book covers as sandals. While some scholars were spared and recruited by the Mongols, the unique interdisciplinary culture of the House of Wisdom was permanently extinguished. The loss of Baghdad shifted the center of Islamic power to Egypt, but the flame had already spread. The Baghdad model of state-funded science and the systemic pursuit of knowledge had already changed the course of human history forever. Knowledge had already begun to filter into Europe through Islamic Spain and Sicily. In 967 CE, a young monk named Gerbert of Aurillac traveled to Catalonia and encountered Arabic works originating in Baghdad. When he later became Pope Sylvester II, he reintroduced the abacus and Hindu-Arabic numerals to Europe. He faced accusations of sorcery because his knowledge was so far beyond his contemporaries. The light was being passed from the Tigris to the heart of Christian Europe, igniting a sleeping continent and preparing it for the end of its dark ages. The structure of Baghdad's madrasas, like the Nizamiya, served as templates for the first European universities in Bologna and Paris. The concepts of a specialized curriculum, salaried faculty, student housing, and even the diploma were hallmarks of the Baghdad system. When the University of Paris was established in the 12th century, it relied heavily on Latin translations of Baghdad's Arabic texts. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra and Ibn al-Haytham's optics were translated into Latin, eventually fueling the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The seeds of our modern education were sown in Iraq. The legacy of the House of Wisdom remains the most enduring foundation of our world. The scientific method of testing hypotheses and the mathematics that power our digital age are its gifts to humanity. Modernity was not born in Europe, it was imported from the banks of the Tigris. Everything that followed built on what was assembled there. The Baghdad model bridged the gap between antiquity and the Renaissance, ensuring the light of reason was never truly extinguished. The light of Baghdad still illuminates our path today, a testament to the eternal power of the human mind. Behind the caliphs were the Barmakids, a Persian family of ministers who served as the architects of the Abbasid administrative state. They were the ultimate patrons, funding libraries, hospitals, and schools from their own vast fortunes. They understood that a stable empire required a thriving intellectual class and a civil service grounded in math and law. Their fall was swift and tragic, but the institutional foundations they laid during their decades of power ensured that Baghdad's Golden Age would outlast their family's influence for centuries. They turned patronage into an art form. Inside the House of Wisdom, the scriptorium was a hive of activity. Hundreds of scribes and translators worked in shifts, their quills scratching across paper day and night. This was not mere copying, it was critical scholarship. They collated different versions of the same Greek or Persian text, noted discrepancies, and added their own commentaries. This iterative process of refinement meant that the Baghdad version of an ancient text was often more accurate and comprehensive than the original. They were the world's first critical editors, perfecting the past to build the future. Knowledge was treated as a vital strategic resource. Caliphs didn't just collect books, they negotiated for them in peace treaties and demanded them as tribute after battles. A single rare manuscript from Constantinople was worth as much as a mountain of silver. The logistics of the translation movement required a global network of buyers, scouts, and couriers. Baghdad's power was not just measured in the strength of its armies, but in the depth of its archives. The House of Wisdom was the world's most valuable vault, containing the true currency of the future, information. In the laboratories of Baghdad, Jabir ibn Hayyan, known as Geber, was turning alchemy into chemistry. He was a master of experimental science, insisting that theory without practice was useless. He invented the alembic for distillation and developed processes like crystallization and evaporation that are still the building blocks of chemical engineering today. His classification of substances based on their properties laid the groundwork for the periodic table. Jabir was searching for the philosopher's stone, but what he found was the systematic language of the physical world. His labs were the birth of industrial science. The Abbasid commitment to knowledge extended to the body. Baghdad pioneered the Bimaristan, the first truly modern public hospitals. These were secular institutions, open to people of all faiths and social classes. They featured specialized wards for different diseases, pharmacies, and even music and storytelling for mental health. Physicians were required to pass exams and hold licenses, a system of medical accreditation that was centuries ahead of its time. The Bimaristan was not just a place to die, it was a place of healing, where the latest discoveries from the House of Wisdom were applied in real time. The mathematics of Baghdad found their most beautiful expression in architecture. The complex geometric patterns known as giri, seen in the Alhambra and the great mosques of Persia, were impossible without the advanced algebra and trigonometry developed in the House of Wisdom. These designs reflected a deep understanding of symmetry and a periodic tiling that Western mathematicians would only fully grasp in the 20th century. In Baghdad, math was not a dry abstraction. It was the visual language of the divine, carved into stone and baked into tile for all to see. The city itself was a living equation. To reach for the stars, al-Ma'mun built the first major astronomical observatories in Baghdad and Damascus. These were state-funded research centers where scholars used massive brass instruments to measure the movements of the planets and the angle of the Earth's tilt. They weren't just observing, they were correcting. They found that the ancient Greek calculations of Ptolemy were off by significant margins. By refining these measurements, they created the most accurate astronomical tables the world had ever seen. These tables would later guide the explorers and navigators who would map the entire globe. The sky was no longer a mystery, it was a map. Al-Kindi, the philosopher of the Arabs, had a secret life as the world's first master cryptanalyst. In the 9th century, he wrote a manuscript on deciphering cryptographic messages, where he introduced frequency analysis, the revolutionary idea that you could break a cipher by analyzing the frequency of letters in a language. This technique would remain the gold standard of code breaking until the invention of the polyalphabetic cipher centuries later. In the paranoid world of the Abbasid court, where secrets were the ultimate currency, Al-Kindi provided the keys to unlock them. He turned information theory into a weapon of statecraft. The paper revolution did more than just spread knowledge. It powered a bureaucratic machine. The Abbasids were the first to run a truly document-based state. Paper was easier to archive and harder to forge than parchment. Every decree, every tax receipt, and every intelligence report from the empire's vast network of spies was recorded and filed in Baghdad. This paper state allowed the caliphs to govern in territory stretching from Spain to India with unprecedented precision. Knowledge of the people was as important as knowledge of the stars. Baghdad was the world's first true information capital, where paper was the blood of the state. As the Golden Age peaked, Baghdad pioneered a new form of education, the madrasa. The Nizamiya, founded in 1065, was the first true college, offering a standardized curriculum, salaried faculty, and even free housing for students. This was the birth of the institutionalized higher education system. These schools weren't just for theology. They taught law, literature, and science. The model of a self-sustaining academic community where students could focus entirely on their studies was a revolutionary concept that would later be exported to Europe, providing the template for the first universities in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris. Education was becoming an industry. Baghdad's light reached Europe through several secret doors. One of the most important was Sicily. Under the Norman kings, who were fascinated by Islamic science, a unique culture of translation flourished. Arabic scholars were invited to court to translate the works of Baghdad for European monarchs. These translations provided the first glimpse of advanced math and medicine for a Europe still mired in the Dark Ages. Sicily was a filter, taking the vast ocean of Baghdad's knowledge and distilling it into a form that the West could finally begin to understand. The bridge was being built, stone by stone, across the Mediterranean. The end of a world began on January 17, 1258. Mongol vanguards, using their mastery of the landscape, diverted the Tigris River to flood the caliph's military camp at night. The elite cavalry, the pride of the Abbasid army, was drowned or routed in the chaos. Baghdad's 30,000-man garrison was suddenly left alone to face the full weight of the 150,000-strong Mongol horde. The city of peace, which had stood for 5 centuries, was now a city under the shadow of a total solar eclipse. The forces of chaos were at the gates, and the river itself had turned against its masters. By January 29th, the encirclement was absolute. Hulagu Khan brought with him 1,000 Chinese siege engineers, masters of gunpowder and complex mangonels. Because stone was scarce in the plains of Iraq, they cut down the city's famous palm groves to use as projectiles and hauled massive rocks from the mountains of Jalula. The sky over Baghdad was no longer filled with the stars of al-Batani, but with the fire of Mongol catapults. Every day, the circular walls, once a geometric statement of perfection, were being pounded into dust. The city of al-Mansur was becoming a tomb of brick and mortar. The pressure was unbearable. On February 10th, Caliph al-Mustasim officially surrendered. He walked out of the city gates with 3,000 of his highest dignitaries and officials, hoping to negotiate a mercy that Hulagu had no intention of granting. They were divided into groups and systematically executed. The caliph was forced to watch as his court, the heirs to Harun al-Rashid, were silenced forever. The Golden Age didn't end with a whimper, but with the sound of 1,000 swords. The city of peace had no more peace to offer. The sack was about to begin, and history would never be the same. The sack of Baghdad began on February 13th. For 1 week, Mongol troops were given free rein to massacre and loot. Estimates of the dead range from 90,000 to over 800,000. The House of Wisdom and its 36 public libraries were razed. The unique interdisciplinary culture that had bridged humanity for 500 years was extinguished in 7 days. The last caliph was executed to avoid spilling royal blood, rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. Another story says he was locked in a room full of his gold and left to starve. Baghdad, the center of the world, was now a void. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with the ink of 1,000,000 manuscripts thrown into its waters and red with the blood of the scholars who tried to save them. Survivors noted that Mongol soldiers even used the heavy leather covers of ancient books as sandals. While some scholars were recruited by the Mongols to serve their new masters, the institutional memory of the House of Wisdom was permanently destroyed. The loss of Baghdad shifted the center of Islamic power to the Mamluks in Egypt, but the spirit of the Round City, the absolute commitment to universal knowledge, was gone forever. The light of the world had truly gone out. But the seeds of Baghdad had already been sown in the dark soil of Europe. Through the great translation schools in Toledo and Sicily, the works of al-Khwarizmi, al-Razi, and Ibn al-Haytham had been translated into Latin decades before the fall. These texts were like time capsules, carrying the advanced logic and science of the East to a West that was finally ready to wake up. These Arabic translations were the only reason Europe recovered the works of its own Greek ancestors. The bridge had been built before the fire. The House of Wisdom fell, but its children would ignite the Renaissance. The legacy of the House of Wisdom is the foundation of our modern world. The scientific method, the mathematics of the digital age, and the institutional structure of our universities were all born on the banks of the Tigris. Modernity was not a European invention. It was an import from the City of Peace. Everything that followed built on what was assembled there over 5 centuries of intense, funded scholarship. The Baghdad model bridged the gap between antiquity and our future, ensuring the light of reason was never truly extinguished. The light of Baghdad still illuminates our path today, an eternal testament to the power of wisdom.
The Abbasid Golden Age was not only an age of scholars and manuscripts. It was an age of medicine, of architecture, of commerce, of music, of agriculture, of governance. An entire civilization operating at a level of sophistication that the rest of the medieval world would take centuries to approach. The hospitals of Abbasid Baghdad were unlike anything that existed anywhere else on earth. The Bimaristan, the Islamic hospital, was an institution of extraordinary complexity. Baghdad's largest hospital, established in the early 9th century, had separate wards for different conditions: internal medicine, surgery, ophthalmology, orthopedics, psychiatric illness. It had a pharmacy, a lecture hall where medical students trained at the bedside, an outpatient clinic, and a policy of treating every patient regardless of ability to pay. Free universal healthcare in the 9th century. The attending physicians were required to pass a licensing examination before practicing. A licensing examination. In 931 CE, the Caliph al-Muqtadir made it mandatory for all physicians in Baghdad to hold a certificate of competency issued by the chief court physician, a medical licensing system 11 centuries before most of the world had one. The agricultural achievements of the Abbasid period transformed not just the Islamic world, but eventually the entire globe. The Arab agricultural revolution, centered on the knowledge networks Baghdad coordinated, spread crops, techniques, and irrigation systems across 3 continents. Sugarcane, cotton, rice, citrus fruits, artichokes, spinach, and dozens of other crops were systematically transplanted from their regions of origin across the Islamic world through a knowledge-sharing network that used Baghdad as its hub. When these crops eventually reached Europe via Al-Andalus in Spain, European agriculture was transformed. The foods that Europeans today consider native to their continent, the orange, the lemon, the aubergine, the artichoke, arrived via the Arab agricultural revolution that the Abbasid Golden Age coordinated. The commercial infrastructure of the Abbasid Caliphate was equally transformative. Baghdad sat at the intersection of the most important trade routes in the medieval world: the Silk Road from China, the Indian Ocean trade routes from South and Southeast Asia, the overland routes from Central Asia and Persia, and the Mediterranean networks connecting to Europe and Africa. The Abbasid period developed the first sophisticated letters of credit, financial instruments that allowed merchants to conduct transactions across thousands of miles without physically transporting gold. The Suftaja, a form of bill of exchange, allowed a merchant in Baghdad to send a letter that could be cashed in Samarkand or Cairo or Cordoba. Medieval Islamic banking invented the conceptual infrastructure that European banking later adopted, and the modern global financial system ultimately descends from. The Arabic language in the Abbasid period became the global language of science in the same way English functions today, not because of conquest alone, but because the scientific literature worth reading was written in Arabic. European scholars who wanted access to the latest mathematics, medicine, astronomy, or philosophy had to learn Arabic. The names they gave to the stars, Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Vega, Altair, are Arabic because Arab astronomers named them. The mathematical terms, algebra, algorithm, cipher, zero, are Arabic because Arab mathematicians developed the concepts. The chemical terms, alcohol, alkali, alchemy, are Arabic because Arab chemists defined the discipline. The legacy is embedded in the language of science itself, visible to anyone who looks. The architectural achievement of Abbasid Baghdad deserves its own consideration. The round city that al-Mansur built was supplemented over the following century by a complex of palaces, mosques, gardens, markets, and public buildings that contemporary visitors from Byzantium and China described with a combination of awe and bewilderment. The Caliph's palace complex, the Golden Gate Palace, was said to be visible from a day's ride away due to the green dome that topped its central audience hall. The city's markets were organized by trade, a street of booksellers, a street of perfumers, a street of metalworkers, a street of cloth merchants, the organizational logic of the modern shopping district invented in medieval Baghdad. And then there was the literature. The collection of stories that eventually reached the West as 1001 Nights, the Alf Layla wa Layla, was assembled and written down in its classical form during the Abbasid period. Scheherazade, Sinbad, Ali Baba, Aladdin, characters that entered the global literary imagination, were products of the multilingual, multicultural, cosmopolitan Abbasid world, stories from Persia, India, Arabia, and Egypt woven together in the Arabic language and given their immortal form in the city al-Mansur built on the Tigris. But every golden age contains within it the forces that will end it. The Abbasid Caliphate was no exception. The Golden Age began to fracture from the mid-9th century onward as the caliphs increasingly relied on Turkish military commanders, the Gulam, who gradually accumulated more real power than the caliphs they nominally served. By the 10th century, the Abbasid caliphs had become largely ceremonial figures, religious symbols rather than political rulers, while real power in Baghdad shifted to a succession of military strongmen, the most significant being the Umayyad dynasty who controlled Baghdad from 945 CE. The intellectual culture survived this transition remarkably well. Scholarship and scientific inquiry continued and in some respects flourished even as political authority fragmented. But the unified state machinery that had funded and organized it at scale was gone. The Crusades from the late 11th century onward brought sustained military pressure from the West. The rise of the Seljuk Turks brought new political masters from the East. The Islamic world fractured into competing courts, each of which continued to patronize scholarship in competition with the others, so that Cordoba, Cairo, Samarkand, and Nishapur all became centers of learning in their own right, a diffusion of the Abbasid model that spread its achievements even as it diluted their concentration. And then, on February 13, 1258, the Mongol army under Hulagu Khan entered Baghdad. What followed over the next week was one of the most catastrophic events in the history of human civilization. The city that al-Mansur had founded 5 centuries earlier, that had housed 1 million people at its peak, that had given the world algebra and the hospital and the scientific method and the bill of exchange, was systematically destroyed. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed, reportedly rolled in a rug and trampled by horses so that his blood would not touch the ground, fulfilling a Mongol superstition about royal blood. The population of Baghdad was massacred. Estimates range from 200,000 to 800,000 dead in a single week. The libraries were burned or thrown into the Tigris. Accounts describe the river running black with ink from hundreds of thousands of manuscripts destroyed in days. The House of Wisdom was gone. The round city was gone. The greatest repository of human knowledge in the medieval world was destroyed in 7 days by an army that saw no value in what it was burning. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt stopped the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered, and preserved Egypt and the Levant from the same fate as Baghdad. The knowledge that survived did so in libraries in Cairo, in the manuscripts that had been copied and distributed across the Islamic world before 1258, in the works that had already reached Al-Andalus in Spain where they were preserved and eventually transmitted to Renaissance Europe. This is the most important fact about the Abbasid Golden Age that history consistently underweights. The European Renaissance, the rebirth of learning that Europe credits as the beginning of the modern world, was built substantially on a foundation of knowledge that came from Baghdad. The Greek texts that Renaissance scholars rediscovered had been preserved, translated, corrected, and extended by Abbasid scholars before Europe knew they existed. The mathematics that enabled the scientific revolution, algebra, trigonometry, the decimal system, were Abbasid in origin. The astronomical models that Copernicus worked from drew on Abbasid calculations. The medical knowledge that European universities taught as cutting-edge scholarship in the 1300s and 1400s had been written in Baghdad 4 and 5 centuries earlier. The Renaissance did not rediscover ancient knowledge. It rediscovered knowledge that the Islamic world had been developing for 5 centuries, and that finally reached Europe through the translations made in Toledo, Palermo, and Salerno by scholars who understood Arabic. Baghdad was the center of the world for 5 extraordinary centuries. It was destroyed in a week, and the knowledge it assembled survived the destruction and traveled west and became the foundation on which the modern world was built. That is not a footnote to European history. That is the story of how human knowledge actually moved across the centuries. And it begins not in Athens, not in Rome, not in Florence, but in a circular city on the banks of the Tigris that a caliph built in 762 CE and named, with a confidence that history proved completely justified, the City of Peace.